The final component we're going to look at is the Navbar component, and this component we're going to use consistently in any website that uses Bootstrap because it's responsible for making our website's navigation menu mobile responsive, which is an important feature in any modern mobile responsive website. So it's important to understand this component, but it's also the most complex component that we've touched on. So feel free to rewind this video a couple times and rewatch it as need be until you're able to kind of grasp and really feel like you understand what's going on with this component. Now the first element, the parent element of our navbar, is going to be a nav element that we assign a class of navbar and navbar default to. These are two classes that we always want to assign the nav element of our navbar component. But you'll also notice that I include this Navbar Fixed Top class to this nav element, and that's because this class sticks the navbar to the top of our viewport, regardless of if we scroll up or down on the web page. It's definitely not a necessity to include it, and sometimes I do, sometimes I don't in my own web pages, but it's important to understand that it's available to us to use if we need it. In addition, there's another class that's a sibling, so to speak, of this one, which is the Nav Bar Fixed Bottom. So if instead we want to fix our navbar to the bottom of our viewport, we can do that as well. Moving on, the child of our nav element is going to be a div element with either container or container fluid as its class. Of course, we're familiar with container and container fluid from the last lesson on Bootstrap CSS, but it's important to point out that this should be nested inside of our nav element, never the other way around. Nested inside of the container fluid class is our navbar header class, which we assign to a div element. Inside of this div element, we're going to place two children. The first child is going to be a button, and this button's going to have a few things going on with it, the most obvious of which are these three span elements nested inside of it. Each of these span elements is given a class of icon bar, and these icon bars are just horizontal bars stacked on top of each other. If you've ever used a mobile responsive website, you've probably become familiar with these. They're the three bars stacked on top of each other that you press, and then it expands out each of the list items in the menu itself. Now remember, Bootstrap is a mobile-first framework, so this is going to be the default view, are these icon bars. But we don't actually have any elements in our navbar yet. We only have these three icon bars that indicate our navbar elements have been collapsed. Now our button contains an attribute that is kind of indicative of where we might place these navbar items, and that's in something that has an ID of my navbar items, and we can deduce that it's an ID because of this hashtag prefix. So we haven't added this element yet, but we know that we need to add some sort of element with the idea of my navbar items. However, before we get to do that, we're going to add one more thing in our navbar header, and that is a Navbar Brand. And essentially this is just a logo that will always show up regardless of the screen size. And Bootstrap will take care of formatting it for us. And now we're ready to go ahead and add some elements to our navbar. And these elements are going to be part of an unordered list nested within this div element. This div element has a class of collapse, navbar collapse, as well as an ID of my navbar items. Remember what we pointed out earlier, where this data target lists hashtag my navbar items as its value, so we deduced that we would need an element with this ID, and lo and behold, here it is. So now we can conclude that this button is going to toggle whatever's contained in this div element back and forth as users click on that button. And what's contained in this, like we said, is an unordered list. And this unordered list looks very similar to what we just learned about in the last section on navs, where we have a nav class assigned to it, but instead of being a nav pills or nav tabs class, we're going to assign a navbar-nav class since we're nesting it with inside a navbar. And finally, I put a little navbar-right class assigned to this that's very similar in function to the navbar fixed top in that it's optional and it positions our elements in a particular part of the viewport. So without further ado, let's go ahead and add some of these elements. And the first elements I'm going to add are just some anchor tags, nothing new here. We see that we still have this active class available to us for specific list items within our unordered list. We can also add things like forms to our list items, and so long as we give it this navbar form class, it's going to be styled nicely in our navbar. But I do want to point out, in this case, I have a button that functions very similar to the input group button, but inside of a nav bar, it's a bad idea to use input groups because the styling might not be consistent. So here I've placed it inside of our form, but outside of our form group. And I'm still using the form group and form control classes for my inputs. Now the last item that I'm going to add is just a standalone button, and there's something interesting about the standalone button we'll notice is that I applied a class of Navbar BTN to this button, but not to the button inside of my form. And the reason for this is that Navbar BTN is going to vertically center my button in my navbar. However, the form already takes care of that for all of the elements nested within it for us. So to add navbar-btn to a button within a form in our navbar is actually a redundant class to add. And I'd say it looks pretty good. We have our brand logo to the left of our navbar and then some space created by using the navbar right class to right align all of our navbar elements. We have this subtle shaded background of the active list item within our navbar unordered list. We have a text input field that is nicely formatted and evenly centered vertically, as are our buttons, both our Go Search button and our Sign Out button. So overall, I'd say that for not having to write any CSS ourselves or any JavaScript ourselves, this is quite a win. But here's the real test, is what happens as our viewport gets narrower. Let's go ahead and find out by shrinking the width of our viewport. And we see that once we shrink it to a sufficiently small size, now it collapses into these icon bars. And then when we click the icon bars, it toggles our elements accordingly.